A haunting reality lurks within the ferocity of nature's most dangerous and fierce animals. From the colossal jaws of the great white to the sheer power of a grizzly bear's massive paws, there are predators in the wild who are capable of taking down even the strongest people. However, most predators prefer an easy target, one they can take down without too much of a fight. Being slower, smaller, and more curious, children have oftentimes fallen victim to one of these beasts. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are 3 of the worst animal attacks on children covered on the channel so far. Welcome to Final Affliction. As symbols of death and the devil, snakes have always been a particularly divisive animal and tend to have a drastically different effect on different people. Some hate them and squirm at the idea of being anywhere near one, whereas others love them so much that they want to keep them in their homes. It is estimated that over 160,000 snakes are currently kept as pets in Canadian homes, and with few regulations about the breeding of these animals, there can be issues regarding their behavior, which can result in tragedy. Regardless of personal opinion about the animal, it is generally agreed that snakes, especially very large ones, should be correctly enclosed and kept away from children. Unfortunately, this was not the case when Noah and Connor Barthe entered the home of a family friend who owned an exotic pet store, a home that they would never leave. When 6-year-old Connor and his 4-year-old brother Noah were invited to a sleepover next door at a friend's house to see the animals that were held in the home, they were very excited. Even at this young age, they were already very interested in animals, and the idea of being able to get closer to them than any zoo would ever allow made the invite even more enticing. The friend's father was Jean-Claude Savoie, and he owned the local exotic pet store. He loved being able to show off his collection to children, believing that the interest might stick and lead to a lifelong hobby. The boys regularly spent the night over at his house, as his son was close friends with the boy, and so Jean-Claude was seen as an extension of the family. He cared for the boys very much and considered them to be his other sons, so he would always make sure they were happy and well taken care of. They spent their day playing in the garden, interacting with goats, rabbits, cats, and dogs. They held the snakes and played in the empty tanks. To end the day, Jean-Claude took them out in his tractor, even letting them steer it, which they were delighted by. When they were finished, they cleaned themselves up and headed to bed around midnight. The brothers were set up in the living room on the sofa, while Jean-Claude and his son slept in their rooms. The boys were excited to be sleeping at their friend's house, and the idea that tomorrow they would be playing with even more animals made them barely able to sleep. Sadly, the boys would never wake again. Unbeknownst to anyone in the apartment, one of the exotic animals was planning an escape that night. In the room adjacent to where the young boys were sleeping, there was a 100-pound, 14-foot African rock python with an open vent above it. The species was illegal in Canada unless the owner had a specific license, which Jean-Claude did not have. But the man believed that it was a welcome addition to his collection, which he enjoyed showing off to people. The snake was not friendly, and at times was particularly aggressive towards humans, as it was a timid animal and would attack when scared. The animal had already attempted to escape earlier in the week through the vent, but it had gotten stuck, leading Jean-Claude to believe that the snake was too big to ever escape through the hole, and so it wouldn't need to be covered up or fixed. This was a decision that would cause the disastrous results of that night. The snake was hungry. It hadn't been fed in the last 24 hours, and so it was forced to try to find its own food. In its malnourished state, it was much smaller, which meant that it was now able to fit into the vent and found its way into the ventilation shaft. It slowly slithered through the shaft, moving from room to room as it tried to figure out where it could get its next meal. Although it was slim enough to fit through the shaft, its 100-pound weight began to take a toll on the ventilation shaft. and when it was making its way over the living room, it fell. Pythons will naturally constrict if they are in danger, and so, when the snake finally fell onto something, it grasped it tightly and continued to constrict. There was a smell of farm animals that filled the room, and so the snake concluded that the thing it had grabbed onto was a prey animal. Unfortunately, the snake was incorrect, and it had in fact fallen on top of the sleeping brothers. The smell was coming from them, as they had been playing on the farm all day, but the snake was not able to differentiate this. It could smell prey, and so it would treat the boys as it would any other prey. The boys initially tried to struggle, but were immediately overpowered. The snake was made of pure muscle, and the boys were no match for such prehistoric power. It began to constrict more, wrapping itself around the necks of the boys and biting mercilessly at the children's faces. As the children stopped struggling, the snake continued to bite and squeeze the children, either in an attempt to stabilize itself after the fall or because it was attempting to eat its prey. It is thought that the boys passed away quite quickly as the snake squeezed harder and gradually suffocated them. Although it would have been initially painful and terrifying for the children, we can only hope that it was over quickly and as painlessly as possible. Despite the speed of the attack, the snake did not try to consume the children and instead left them where it had killed them, their lifeless bodies giving the impression that they were peacefully sleeping. Jean-Claude woke up early and came into the living room at 6:30 a.m. He saw the children on the floor, and in the dim light, he could see their sleeping faces, and so continued into the kitchen quietly so that he wouldn't wake them. He accidentally made some noise in the kitchen and peeked out to check on the boys, expecting the sound to have woken them up, but they hadn't moved. This was unusual, and Jean-Claude started to have a bad feeling about the entire situation. He flicked on the lights to double-check when he saw the collapsed ceiling and debris across the floor. The boys still hadn't moved, so he initially worried that the debris had hurt the children, but then he saw his snake waiting in the corner. He looked at the animal and then at the boys and realized what had happened. The boys were blue. His snake had killed them. He ran out of the room to the boys' mother's house, banging on her door and shouting for her. "Oh my God, your kids are dead." Mandy heard the words echo through her hallway and her heart stopped. Her boyfriend ran from the house to check next door, and when he returned, his face was white. "It's true. It's a f***ing nightmare, but it's true." Mandy's world ended with those words. The tragedy hit the news worldwide, and thousands of people sent prayers to the family of the two young boys who were killed in such an unfortunate and graphic way. The snake was taken from the scene and euthanized by a vet who commented on how aggressive the animal was. Mandy began legal proceedings against Jean-Claude for criminal negligence, causing death, to avenge her children. But she knew that nothing would ever be good enough. She would never get her children back. During the case, they found that Jean-Claude had been warned by other reptile owners that he needed to cover the vent as soon as possible, as the snake would be able to escape. But he took his time to get it fixed, thinking that the animal was too large to fit through. What he didn't take into account is the amount that snakes can contract their muscles, especially when they haven't been fed. To convict the snake owner for criminal negligence, the court needed to answer 3 questions. 1. Did he fail in his duty as an adult to protect the children? 2. Did he show reckless disregard for their safety? 3. Did he fail to take appropriate measures to protect the children, causing their death? After 3 years of court proceedings, Jean-Claude Savoie was found not guilty and the case was dropped against him. Although their mother was disappointed with the result, it didn't matter to her. She would still have to continue life without her children, who at the hands of her friend met their terrifying final affliction.
Matt and Melissa Graves from Elkhorn, Nebraska, had decided to take their children on the holiday of a lifetime. After months of excitement building in the household, The vacation had finally arrived, and they headed to Florida in June 2016. Their destination? Disney World, Orlando. After experiencing some of the very best rides in the world, the family headed down to the relative quiet of the Seven Seas Lagoon one evening. Seven Seas was a man-made lagoon that offered boating and fishing experiences. There were a number of people walking along the shores, running on the beaches, and fishing from a couple of boats. Although it was late for the children, around 8:30 p.m., Matt and Melissa decided that it was their holidays, that they would stay up this once. On the shores of the lake, there was an outdoor movie experience for them to enjoy. It was something that they had never done before. Matt and Melissa sat and watched the movie, but as the children were so young, they weren't interested in what was on the big screen. Instead, they played on the beach, digging up the sand and splashing in the water. Matt and Melissa had packed with them a bucket and spade. They pulled them out of their bag and handed them to the children. 2-year-old Lane jumped up and down excitedly, toddling onto the sand that ran down to the edge of the lake. He grabbed the bucket from his older sister and began filling it up with sand. His parents helped him turn the bucket over, tap it 3 times, and then lift it up to reveal a sandcastle. Lane squealed in delight, and the family did this over and over. After some considerable time playing in the sand, Matt and Melissa decided that it was getting late and time to go. When they got up to leave, Lane cried out in defiance. His parents looked at each other. They decided to give in to their toddler's demands and stay a little longer. What harm could it do? When it came time to dig the trench around the mound of sandcastles, Lane picked up the bucket once more and ran to the lake. Wading into the ankle-deep water, Matt and Melissa watched on as he splashed into the shallows. He patted his feet up and down, looking down as his toes sank into the muddy, sandy substrate. Then, the 2-year-old bent over and scooped up a bucket of water to take back to the moat they were building. Suddenly, and without warning, there was a huge commotion. In an instant, their happy, playful toddler, who was giggling and grinning, was snatched by an alligator just feet from his family. Matt leapt up from the sand. He jumped onto the alligator, wrestling it into the water. The alligator had its jaws wrapped around Lane's head. Matt thrust his hand into the alligator's mouth. He tried desperately to pry them open, but the great beast thrashed around, throwing Matt off of its back. In the frantic commotion, Matt claims that another alligator went for him in a frenzied attack. It is unclear whether the minor injuries he suffered were from the alligator that took Lane or from a second one joining in on the attack. No sooner than it had happened, the alligator vanished, sinking beneath the water's surface. In a moment of shock and terror, the family were forced to watch their young son being dragged underwater by the terrifying 7-foot beast. In those first heart-stopping seconds, Matt and Melissa ran into the water where their boy had been dragged under. A lifeguard was alerted and came running to the scene. The water was murky and brown. Matt dived under the water again and again, scrambling about with his hands to feel for any sign of their son. He couldn't see a thing. He couldn't feel anything. Every time he reached out, all he did was grab fistfuls of the squelchy, muddy lake's bottom. As he came up for air, he saw Melissa frantically rushing through the shallows, screaming and yelling. Lane made for easy prey. He was only 37 inches tall and weighed 30 pounds. Standing defenseless in the shallows, he was an easy target. Alligators are ambush hunters. They are apex predators in their environment. They typically take fish, turtles, muskrats, birds, and deer. Unlike their crocodile cousins, they are typically less aggressive, and it is rare for them to attack humans. But when they do, they rely on the element of surprise and their bite force. The pressure from an alligator's bite is comparable in pressure to the weight of a small pickup truck. Onlookers at the lagoon could do nothing but watch in absolute horror, hoping upon hope that the boy would somehow resurface. But with each passing minute, their hopes were dashed. Emergency services arrived on the scene within minutes. Jumping into a boat, they scoured the lake. A massive search operation involving over 50 officers was initiated, and devastatingly, Orange County divers came across Lane the following afternoon, 17 hours after the attack. He was lying limp and lifeless in just 6 feet of water. Submerged, he had been left by the alligator only yards from where he had been taken. Heartbreakingly, he was just feet from where Matt and Melissa had frantically searched for him, but the muddy waters churned up by the commotion in the water made it impossible to see below the surface. Lane's body was pulled from the water, carried back to the beach and into the arms of his devastated mother. Rescuers pronounced him dead at the scene. Wildlife officers concluded that although Lane had suffered trauma to his head and neck, he had drowned when the alligator had dragged him into the water. There were only a couple of puncture wounds where the alligator had grabbed him. His body had been untouched after the attack. It is likely that the action of Matt jumping onto the alligator and attempting to free his son from its powerful grip had startled the predator, and after dragging the boy underwater, it had then let go. Lake Kissimmee near Orlando has the second biggest populations of alligators in Florida. It is home to almost 2,000. Their large numbers force some individuals to look elsewhere for food and territory to avoid competition. Some make it into recreational lakes frequented by locals and tourists alike. Following the devastating incident, officers captured and euthanized 6 alligators from the lagoon. When the alligators were examined, their stomachs were empty, suggesting that the reptiles inhabiting the Disney lagoon were hungry. The attack on Lane had been predatory. His actions had not provoked the alligator in any way. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Since June 2016, Disney World has erected warning signs along the edges of the lagoon, warning tourists of the presence of alligators. Although alligator attacks in Florida are rare, they do occur and they have devastating consequences. Lane was simply enjoying his vacation with the people who loved him most in the world. The alligator was simply taking advantage of an opportunity, one that resulted in Lane Graves' terrifying final affliction.
In August 2002, Rachel and Pincus Schwimmer took their 3 children for a holiday in the Catskill Mountains. They were from Brooklyn, New York, but always visited the Catskills for their vacation. It was something they did every year. They were staying in the village of Woodbridge in the Catskill Mountains. The heavily wooded, mountainous region is situated in the southeast of New York State. It is an area of outstanding natural beauty, a wilderness that stretches for 700 acres. The area is popular with hikers, cyclists, and water sports enthusiasts. In the winter, the Catskills also boast 5 downhill ski areas, which draw thousands of people to the slopes each year. Rachel and Pincus were staying with their 3 children in some summer cottages for their vacation. Those who lived in New York City often ventured to the Catskills to enjoy the fresh air and countryside that it offers. The area once attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Holiday cottages and hotels used to be popular and full to the brim with visitors, but now only a few holiday properties remained. Some of them were in need of refurbishment and looked run down. The young Schwimmer family had spent some time exploring the outdoors and were enjoying their time together. It was a glorious, sunny August day. After lunch, their youngest child, Esther, was due a nap. She was 5 months old. Rachel decided to place the baby in the stroller and head outside the cottage. She and the 2 older children walked around the site quietly while Esther drifted off to sleep in the stroller. Once she was sound asleep, Rachel parked up the buggy just outside the porch of their cottage. Next to it was a large grassy lawn, which she and the older children played on whilst the baby slept. The older children were 4 and 2 years old and happily ran around on the grass, chasing each other and squealing in delight. Unknown to Rachel, there was a bear nearby. It was a young male black bear, probably only 2 years old or so. He was one that had become accustomed to people and frequented the holiday cottages. He was on the prowl for scraps of food. He often rooted around in the trash, eating people's leftovers before heading back into the woods. The bear lifted his head. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. He walked purposefully towards the holiday cottages where Esther slept peacefully. Suddenly, there was a shout from one of the holiday makers. Rachel couldn't make sense of it at first. She stood up and looked around. Then the shout came again. "Bear!" Rachel saw a young male black bear come ambling out of the surrounding woodland. It headed straight for the grassy lawn and the family. Hurriedly, Rachel grabbed her 4-year-old and 2-year-old and ran to the cottage with them under her arms. She rushed inside and told them to stay there while she went back outside for the baby. But it was too late. She heard terrified screams and watched in horror as the black bear knocked Esther from her buggy. The screaming infant landed on the ground. Then, in one swift movement, the baby was lifted up in the bear's jaws. It shook her tiny body from side to side. The baby's screams were ear-piercing as she hung in the bear's mouth. Everyone came running out of their accommodations to see what all the commotion was. When they saw the dramatic and terrifying scene unfolding, they began running at the bear. They shouted and screamed at it to drop the baby. Reports suggest that Pincus, Esther's father, chased the bear. He was injured as the bear swiped at him, but he kept running at the bear, trying desperately to reach his baby girl. In a panic, the young male black bear ran into the woods, less than 20 yards away, with Esther still in his mouth. Several people, including Pincus, pursued it. They picked up rocks and stones and hurled them at the bear. At first, the bear stood its ground as the rocks came crashing down on it, hitting it on its back and face. But then, amongst the chaos of the screaming and shouting, the bear panicked and dropped the infant. Then it turned and ran off into the woods. Fallsburg police officer Dave Decker arrived within minutes of the incident. When he pulled up, he noticed the baby's stroller knocked over in the middle of the grass. He followed the sound of shouts and screams into the nearby woodland. The infant lay on the ground, and Rachel ran up to her. She was bloodied, and her screams had died down. Rachel wrapped her in a blanket, and an ambulance was called. Tragically, on the way to Ellenville Hospital, Esther died from severe neck and head injuries. It had happened in a matter of seconds. Everyone was shocked and stunned. Panic began to spread through the people. Backup police officers who arrived on the scene shortly after Esther had been ambulanced off found the bear. It hadn't moved very far from the site and had climbed up a tree. The officers took aim and fired 5 shots at the bear. It fell to the ground with a heavy thump. The bear was taken away for an autopsy and to find out whether it was suffering from anything that could have altered its behavior. Woodbridge Mayor James Slater said that bear attacks in the area are very rare, and Ward Stone, the state's chief pathologist, said that in his 34 years on the job, he had never come across anything like it. That's why he was determined to find out whether the bear had a disease. Usually, the black bears in that region were very shy and ran away from humans. The only trouble they caused was from eating bird seed put out by locals and dog food. Encounters with people were few and far between. Rabies was ruled out, as were a number of other viruses. Inside the bear's stomach was woodland vegetation, as well as human food, small plastic bags, fruit labels, and aluminum foil. The bear had clearly become accustomed to feasting on human food and was attracted to the area because of it. The bear hadn't been tagged, which happens if a bear has caused problems before. He was a young male, weighing about 155 pounds, 70 kilograms. He likely hadn't long left his mother and was finding his feet in terms of foraging for food and securing territory. Wildlife experts tried examining the bear's brain to look for any abnormalities, but 2 of the officers' bullets struck the bear in the head, making that difficult. Experts say that he was probably attracted to the young family and, in particular, the baby, due to its unusual smell. Milk and diapers may have enticed the curious bear, and some suggest that he may not have intended to kill the baby. Prior to this attack, the last known fatality involving a bear in New York State was in 1987. This was an unusual incident, though, in which a young boy climbed into the polar bear enclosure at Prospect Park Zoo in Brooklyn. He was fatally mauled by 2 polar bears there. At the time of the attack in 2002, the American Bear Association said that only 40 deaths in the whole of North America were due to black bears. Esther had been incredibly unlucky. Following Esther's death, there were calls for bear hunting to be introduced in neighboring states, New Jersey and Connecticut. At the time of the fatality, bear hunting was illegal in these 2 states, and as a result, numbers of bears have been rising rapidly. This has led to more bear-human encounters and frequent complaints about bears wandering into residential areas and even people's homes. Feeding bears, intentionally or unintentionally, can lead to a dangerous situation where the bear becomes habituated to human presence and loses its natural fear of people. When bears become used to being fed by humans, They may start to associate people with food and become more likely to approach humans in search of a meal. This behavior can pose a serious risk to human safety, as bears can become aggressive if they feel threatened or if they perceive humans as a source of food. Once a bear has learned to associate people with food, it may continue to seek out human food sources, even if they are not being intentionally fed. This can create a dangerous situation for both humans and bears, as bears that have become habituated to humans may be more likely to attack. Situations like what happened to Esther Schwimmer can be drastically reduced, and people can enjoy nature without meeting their final affliction.